The year is 1546. It is the death of Martin Luther. Martin Luther died in February of that year, and Martin Luther did not have a successor named for himself. He didn't really want to be known as the head of the church. He didn't want there to be a head of the church. Once he died, the Lutheran Church kind of was looking for a person that would lead them. They turned to the person I was talking about in the last episode, Philip Melancthon, to be the leader of the Lutheran Church at the time. Melancthon was not as strong-willed as Luther, and as we noticed, he was more of a politician. Well, in 1546 in Germany, in the years that came afterwards, some of the people that had been protecting Luther had passed away. Luther was kind of by himself, or at least as a political person, and then he was being protected by his lector. Well, once he died, they heard about this in the Roman Catholic territories, and they thought what would be the easiest way to get rid of the Lutherans was to attack. And so from 1546 on, the war between the Lutherans and the Roman Catholic territories of Germany started. It didn't really hit its peak until mid-1550s. And during this time, Melancthon being in charge, we have what are known as the interims. The Leipzig interim is the most famous one, where the Roman Catholics army had pushed all the way in and had conquered Wittenberg, Germany, and they had taken or let the Germans, the Lutherans, to escape to Leipzig. Well, in the Leipzig interim, they had them there and said, okay, what is it that your church believes? And we are going to mandate what you can do on a Sunday morning. Melancthon being in charge and being a politician, he was kind of like, well, how far can I go with still keeping the Lutheran faith? And it had to do with Sunday mornings. Now, just a word here. If you have more questions on this, just let me know, because I wrote my Master of Divinity paper on this, and it is a section where Melancthon was like, okay, what can I get away with and still keep the Lutheran faith? Because Luther had rewritten what we consider the Sunday morning service, the divine service. He had said, okay, we're first of all doing everything in German, all the readings, the sermon. We're getting rid of certain things. The two things that, most of the things that Luther got, the two big things is what we call the prayers or the canons between the words of institution and the distribution in the Lord's Supper, and what we call the Corpus Christi procession. Both of those would be, as soon as the pastor would say the words of institution, then he would have this long, drawn-out prayer about lifting this up as a sacrifice, the canon of the Mass, and then processing around the building, holding up the body of Christ and bringing it into the middle of people, not distributing it. It was the Corpus Christi procession. Those things are what Luther changed in the Lutheran service, everything in German and getting rid of these two parts. Well, when the political powers got Melancthon and his fellow Lutherans in Leipzig, Melancthon said, well, we can still be Lutheran if we put back in the readings in Latin. We can still be Lutheran if we allow the Corpus Christi procession. So that's what happened. Everything else, including the article on justification and everything else, was the same. But those two things that Melancthon left back in, and the other one was that he left in, and some churches do this today and we don't quite understand, is the ringing of the bells. During the Lord's Supper or during a baptism, the bell would be rung when the pastor is saying the words. Well, those are the things that Melancthon said, okay, we can allow this to happen. Melancthon was thinking, this is the only way I'm going to be able to save the Lutheran Church. If I don't allow the Roman Catholics to say, okay, you can change the liturgy, but you got to keep these couple of things, Melancthon is thinking, okay, all is lost. It is not looking good for the Germans in that 1550s because they didn't have any military might to say get rid of the Roman Catholics. And so Melancthon thinking, well, I'm going to have to play a politician and let these things happen. This is what we call the adiaphora controversy that comes about in the Book of Concord, because Melancthon is causing trouble to say, in a time of confession, what do you confess? Is it okay to have the readings in German and then in Latin? Is it okay to have the ringing of the bell? Is it okay to have the Corpus Christi procession? Just saying it's the body of Christ. I know in our day when these things are brought up, we'd probably say the first one, well, if you're reading in the lessons in German and then in Latin, is it going to make much difference? No, not really, because will the people understand the Latin reading? The next would be is, what about the Corpus Christi procession? Do people think about when we say this, as you hold it up at the end, when the pastor says, the peace of the Lord be with you always, is he lifting up the body of Christ and the blood of Christ? And as Lutherans, we would say yes. But do we want to process around and say, okay, we're going to carry this around and say, instead of, as we would say, distribute to the people? Because if we just look at it, is it doing us any good? And that is what was thought about during the adiaphora controversy. At a time of confession, do we have to stand up and say, this is what we believe and not that? The difference between those two things. And that is in the Book of Concord, which happens a little bit later on. But as you can see, Melancthon here is the one that causes this controversy to happen. He is wanting to make sure that he can keep the Lutheran Church alive. Done? Hello?